Fire Trump just made a major move, Washington is in shock. 2026. Every single person in Washington is talking about this right now, from senators to strategists to reporters who've covered this White House for years, because President Trump just made a move so unexpected that even his own allies are struggling to keep up, and by the end of this video you're going to understand exactly what happened, why it matters, and what could come next. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel, the place where we break down the biggest political stories happening right now in a way that's clear, straightforward, and doesn't waste your time with fluff. If you're new here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because we cover stories exactly like this one on a regular basis, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming in future videos. Today we're diving deep into the latest developments coming out of the Trump administration, the shockwaves it's sending through Washington, and how everyday Americans are being affected whether they realize it or not. This one is a long one because there's a lot to unpack, so stick around until the end, because we're going to connect some dots that most mainstream coverage has been keeping separate. Let's start with the big picture, because to understand why Washington is reacting the way it is right now, you need to understand just how many things are happening simultaneously. This isn't a single headline story, it's a collision of multiple major developments all hitting at once, and that's exactly why the reaction has been so intense. On one hand, you have an escalating standoff with Iran centered around the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical waterways for global oil shipping. On the other hand, you have growing tension in Gaza despite an official ceasefire supposedly being in place. And layered on top of all of that, you have a presidency whose approval ratings have reportedly dropped to their lowest point yet, even as the administration continues to project total confidence in its direction. When you put all of these pieces together, you start to understand why people in Washington are calling this moment a genuine turning point. Let's break down the Iran situation first, because this is really at the center of everything right now. For months, tensions between the United States and Iran have been building, and the Strait of Hormuz has become the flashpoint everyone is watching most closely. A massive percentage of the world's oil supply moves through that narrow passage every single day, which means any instability there doesn't just affect the Middle East, it ripples out across the entire global economy almost instantly. Just recently, President Trump made a statement that caught a lot of people off guard, publicly denying that any talks were happening with Iran at all, which directly contradicted comments made by his own administration just days earlier suggesting there was an active back channel being used to communicate with Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. That kind of contradiction from within the same administration, especially on something as serious as ongoing negotiations with a country the US is currently in conflict with, is exactly the kind of thing that sets off alarm bells in Washington. It raises the question of who is actually steering the ship here, and whether there's a coherent strategy at all or if different parts of the administration are simply not on the same page. Adding even more pressure to the situation, Trump also issued a direct and public threat toward Oman, warning the country against interfering with U.S. operations in the Strait of Hormuz. This came right as a 60-day deadline for reaching some kind of resolution with Iran quietly expired without any real breakthrough. Deadlines like that matter in diplomacy because they're often meant to create urgency and force movement, but when they pass without any concrete progress, it usually signals that the situation is getting more entrenched rather than closer to resolution. And that's exactly what appears to be happening here. Instead of de-escalation, we're seeing an intensification, with rhetoric getting sharper and more countries being pulled into the tension whether they want to be or not. That brings us to one of the most significant developments in this entire story, which is the United Arab Emirates making the serious decision to suspend all trade and financial transactions with Iran. This is not a small symbolic gesture. This is a major regional economic power essentially severing financial ties completely, and it's one of the clearest signals yet that the situation in the Gulf region is not calming down, it's accelerating in the wrong direction. When a country with as much economic weight as the UAE makes a move like this, other nations in the region start recalculating their own positions too, and that creates a kind of domino effect that can be very difficult to reverse once it gets going. Now let's talk about how all of this is hitting people's wallets, because this is where the story stops being an abstract foreign policy issue and starts becoming something that affects everyday life. Oil prices have been climbing steadily, and analysts have pointed directly to Trump's comments about there being no active talks with Iran as one of the key drivers behind that increase. Markets don't wait for certainty, they react to expectation, and when the expectation shifts toward prolonged conflict and stalled diplomacy, prices move accordingly almost immediately. This matters because oil prices don't just affect what you pay at the gas pump, they ripple through nearly every part of the economy, from shipping costs to manufacturing to the price of groceries on the shelf. So even if someone isn't following the geopolitics closely, they're going to feel the effects of this story in very tangible, very personal ways over the coming months. Adding another layer of complexity, Yemen's Houthi rebels have claimed responsibility for targeting multiple oil tankers in recent weeks, describing it as part of a maritime blockade on Saudi shipping. This kind of activity adds even more uncertainty to an already volatile region, and it reinforces the idea that this isn't just a two-country conflict between the US and Iran, it's a much broader regional situation involving multiple actors with their own agendas, alliances, and grievances. Washington has to navigate all of these moving pieces simultaneously, and that complexity is part of why there's so much uncertainty right now about what the administration's actual strategy is. Meanwhile, over in Gaza, there's a parallel storyline unfolding that's adding even more pressure on the administration from a different direction. Trump's own envoy, Jared Kushner, reportedly met with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu for several hours, pushing him to scale back near-daily strikes in Gaza that have continued despite a ceasefire technically being in effect. This alone tells you that behind the scenes, there's real concern within the administration about how the situation in Gaza is being perceived, both domestically and internationally. But just one day after that meeting took place, a strike hit a group that Israel described as Hamas commanders. However, sources close to the situation described the target differently, characterizing it as a non-combat logistical team, and tragically, among those killed in that strike were a 13-year-old boy and his father, along with more than a dozen other people who were injured. This kind of outcome, happening so soon after direct diplomatic pressure from the US side, has raised serious questions about whether public statements from the administration are actually translating into real changes on the ground, or whether there's a significant gap between what's being said publicly and what's actually happening in practice. This contradiction is a big part of why Washington insiders are reacting the way they are. It's not just about one policy decision, it's about a pattern that seems to be emerging where public messaging doesn't always line up with the reality unfolding overseas. And when that kind of gap becomes visible, it tends to erode trust, not just among political opponents, but sometimes even among allies and supporters who expect a certain level of consistency from their own side. Now let's shift focus back home, because the domestic political reaction to all of this has been just as significant as the international response. According to recent reporting, Trump's approval ratings have dropped to the lowest point of his entire presidency. That's a notable shift, especially considering how much emphasis the administration typically places on projecting strength and confidence. And yet, even as these numbers have been sliding, the White House has continued to move forward with business as usual in some very visible ways. For example, Trump was recently seen touring construction of a brand new helipad being built on the south lawn of the White House, proudly showcasing the project to reporters and cameras. Now, on the surface, that might seem like a minor, unrelated story, just a president overseeing a construction project on his own property. But the timing of it has become a bit of a lightning rod, because it's happening at the exact same moment that American involvement in an overseas conflict continues to escalate and public approval continues to decline. Critics have pointed to this contrast as evidence of a disconnect between the administration's priorities and the concerns of everyday Americans who are more worried about rising prices and international instability than they are about White House construction projects. Of course, supporters of the administration see this very differently. From their perspective, projecting confidence and continuing forward with domestic projects, even during a tense international moment, is a sign of strength and stability rather than distraction. They argue that any president who appears rattled or overly reactive during a foreign policy crisis risks sending the wrong signal to adversaries, and that maintaining a sense of normalcy at home is actually a deliberate and calculated choice rather than an oversight. Supporters also continue to point to Trump's repeated public statements that preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon remains the top priority, regardless of how long the current standoff takes to resolve, framing the current approach as patient and firm rather than confused or contradictory.